Story 1, The Shadows. In a small town, 3 boys were walking home from the market in the early hours of the night. While walking on a brightly lit street, they all began to notice something. Their shadows did not look right. Their shadows seemed to be facing the wrong direction. Spooked by this, the 3 boys leaped back in shock. However, to their surprise, their shadows did not follow. When they looked down, they saw another set of shadows, but this time, these shadows looked like real shadows. Looking forward again, they saw those shadows begin to rise up and take the shape of each of those boys. Terrified, the 3 boys ran as fast as they could back to their homes and locked the doors behind them. The next day, other residents of the town began to report the same thing. The townsfolk were all horrified by what was happening, and no one wanted to go outside at night anymore. The police heard about this and wanted to prove for themselves if these rumors were true or not. So, 5 officers went out to one of these places where people claimed to have seen these shadow monsters. The police stayed there until night fell. A few hours passed, and the officers were goofing off and having a good time. Suddenly, one of the officers looked down and started to notice 7 shadows on the road. He looked back up and counted 5, including himself. Confused by this, he looked back down and now counted 9 shadows. Shocked, he tried to tell the other officers, "Hey, look at our shadows," he said. Just as he said that, a long black whip came out of their shadows and decapitated 4 of the officers. Horrified, he ran as far as he could from that area until he reached the police station and told the other officers what happened. Story 2, The Old Woman. A 12-year-old boy named David was visiting his 2 cousins with his parents. Upon arriving at his aunt and uncle's house, he greeted them and went to play with his cousins. While playing in their yard, he went back to the house to drink some water. After finishing his drink, he ran back to the yard. However, on his way back, he noticed an old woman coming out of his cousin's house through the door. Curious, he returned to his cousins and asked them, "Who is that old woman I saw coming out of your house?" David said. "What old woman?" his cousins replied. Shocked and spooked, David exclaimed, "The old woman in white clothing I just saw on my way over here." "We don't have any old woman in white clothing living with us," his cousins responded. David and his 2 cousins rushed back to where he saw the old woman, and to their horror, she was nowhere to be found. They checked the entire house and even informed their parents, but they couldn't find her. David's parents, along with his aunt and uncle, gathered them and shared the story. They explained that the old woman they saw must be the ghost of their grandmother, revealing herself to David, and that she was buried not too far from there. Story 3, The Dimension. One winter, 2 young brothers named Jim and Scott were playing in the snow, building a snowman, when they felt the ground shaking, followed by a big bang. Shocked, the brothers looked around frantically and realized that everything had disappeared. They found themselves surrounded by an empty, purple-colored space that seemed like a different dimension. Looking around, they saw a huge chunk of the earth beneath them. With only a few feet of ground, they screamed for help, but no one answered. "What are we going to do? How are we going to get out of here?" Scott said. "I don't know," Jim replied. They started searching the vast, empty space for an exit but couldn't find anything. Eventually, they dropped to the ground and started crying. Suddenly, their snowman started moving. Terrified, the boys moved to the edge of the ground. Realizing they had nowhere to run, they stood there, watching the snowmen they built turn into monsters. The snowmen began attacking the boys. Despite their attempts to defend themselves, the snowmen overpowered and killed them. Story 4, The Tree. One day, in a small village nestled in the mountains, something odd happened. A huge tree suddenly appeared in the center of the village, shocking the residents. They began to believe it was a sign from their god and started worshipping it. A little girl from the village observed this and also started praying to the tree. Every morning, she would go up to the tree and pray beneath it. However, she began to notice something peculiar each morning. She observed that the people who prayed with her were growing increasingly sick and weak. Worried and frightened, she stopped praying to the tree. Not long after, all the villagers began to fall ill, and in the weeks following, people started to die. The little girl was convinced it was because of the tree. One night, she hid behind some other trees and watched the large tree. To her horror, she witnessed something terrible. The roots of the tree were sucking what appeared to be the souls of the village people. The next day, she tried to warn the villagers, but it was too late. The people of the village had all had their souls sucked out, and they were all killed. Only the little girl survived. Story 5, The Boy. A lady was preparing food for her family when she heard a big thud from the basement. She went downstairs and discovered a boy who had accidentally made the noise. Despite his pleas, she continued to beat him. This lady was the boy's aunt, and along with his uncle, they frequently confined him in the basement, subjecting him to constant yelling and abuse. On a fateful day, the boy's overcooked rice enraged his uncle, leading to a brutal beating that tragically ended the boy's life in the kitchen. The following day, the uncle and aunt callously disposed of the boy's body in a garbage bag, driving to a lake where they heartlessly tossed it in. They returned home as if nothing had occurred. Days later, while the aunt was preparing dinner, a series of inexplicable events unfolded. Startled by slamming doors and flying objects in the kitchen, she called out, thinking it was her husband. No response came. Terrified, she sought refuge in her bedroom where the uncle, equally fearful, pleaded for forgiveness. A distant voice denied forgiveness, and the ghost of the boy appeared. 2 kitchen knives flew through the air, piercing the hearts of the uncle and aunt, ending their lives. Story 6, The Bloodsuckers. An old lady was working at a gas station when a car drove in to get gas. As she filled up the tank, she noticed something odd when the boy in the driver's seat smiled at her. His teeth looked unusual, like 2 fangs at the front. Despite her unease, she told herself to forget what she saw, completed the gas fill-up, and watched the car leave. In the days that followed, people began to disappear in the small town. Word spread quickly about these mysterious disappearances among the close-knit townspeople who were deeply intertwined in each other's lives. As the first person vanished, the entire town was on high alert, speculating on what could have happened. The townspeople eventually reached the unsettling conclusion that the recently arrived new family might be responsible. A mob formed and marched towards the house of the newcomers. Upon arrival, they broke down and destroyed the house, searching for the family. Unable to locate the family, the mob became more anxious. Someone accidentally tripped and fell on the door leading to the basement. Gripping their weapons tightly, they entered the basement, only to be horrified by what they found: lifeless bodies drained of blood, the missing townspeople. The new family was nowhere to be found. Story 7, The Doll. Stacy Mathers, a young girl with a passion for playing with dolls, would spend each day in her yard immersed in imaginative play. However, one unfortunate day, she accidentally broke one of her beloved dolls, leaving her devastated. Overwhelmed with sorrow, she implored her father to buy her a replacement. The following day, Stacy accompanied her father to an old toy store, where her eyes caught sight of an antique doll resembling a little girl. Enthralled, she shared her discovery with her father, who decided to purchase the intriguing doll. Excitement filled Stacy as she brought the antique doll home. The subsequent day, as Stacy engaged in play with her dolls, she noticed something unsettling. The antique doll had shifted from its previous position. Confused and puzzled, Stacy brushed it off as imagination and continued playing with the doll. After a day of play, Stacy decided it was time to put the doll away and have dinner. Following the evening meal, she retired to her room for the night. As she slept, a disturbing dream unfolded, with Stacy running through the streets, pursued by an ominous force, the antique doll, now wearing an evil smile. The chase led her to a concrete wall, where, with nowhere left to escape, she screamed for help. In a jarring climax, the doll approached and, in her dream, stabbed her in the heart with a knife, abruptly waking her from the unsettling nightmare. Story 8, The Painting. Rob Johnson, an artist who used to paint every day, abruptly stopped and fell into a deep depression, feeling that his life had lost meaning and contemplating suicide. During a moment of contemplation on whether to end his life, an idea struck him: he could paint a world in which he could escape and live. Filled with newfound inspiration, he began to paint. Upon completing his painting, Rob impulsively thrust his hand into it, and to his astonishment, his entire body was drawn into the painted world. Overjoyed, he explored this new reality with a smile. However, his joy turned to unease when he stumbled upon a dead forest that he didn't recall painting. Intrigued yet cautious, he entered, only to discover giant wolves sleeping. Terrified, he attempted to retreat quietly, but a snapped twig alerted the wolves, triggering a chase that ended with him being devoured when he could no longer outrun them.